Humans. Courageous, adaptable, indomitable. Nobody does warfare quite like us, except maybe ants. Through millions of years of climbing the food chain, the human race was able to forge an empire of its own, slowly turning every strip of land within its grasp into a tool of warfare. Yet, while even the most extreme of biomes were being conquered and reshaped by humanity's grubby hands, the remainder of the animal kingdom could only look on in envy. Yet, as the Holocene period churned on and tribes became city-states, and city-states became empires, even animals weren't safe from taking sides in human warfare. Dogs, cats, horses, even farm animals like chickens, cows and pigs have taken sides in mankind's favourite pastime. Typically they'd just be for mounting or transport, but in some cases, these animals would serve in actual battle, whether as soldiers, disguised weapons, or as psychological warfare. Other times, they'd simply serve as the mascot of a regiment or a battalion, raising morale and giving those within the squad a sense of pride or identity. Like with that one Polish bear that everyone and their mother has talked about on this website at one point or another. So, let's go on a little historical safari tour and take a look at some of history's most standout combat critters, the weird, wacky, and wonderful that the animal kingdom's most battle-ready have to offer, and perhaps even a special guest appearance from one of them. There'll be thrills, chills, and a non-zero amount of adventuring. Let's get going, folks. While of course, humans had always been using animals as mascots and as tools of war, it wasn't until the advent of the printing press that the adventures of those belligerent beasts could truly be spread en masse. My favourite early example of this is, of course, one rather close to home. During the absolute mess that was the 30 Years' War, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and also of Cumberland, and also Holderness, and also Rupert Land, yes, that Rupert's Land, was a bit down on his luck. After serving as a soldier in the Dutch campaign of the war, he'd found himself imprisoned in the fortress city of Linz. He was treated rather nicely during captivity, actually, generally left to his own devices within the fortress during his stay. Most importantly though, he was given a small white poodle to accompany him by an English nobleman. What this poodle was generally called depends on the source you're reading it from. Sometimes sources, like this weirdly shitposty propaganda pamphlet, referred to our good boy as, well, Boye. When Rupert was eventually released in 1641, he decided to ditch Germany altogether and booked it for England, which was just so conveniently ruled by his uncle, Charles I. He might not have known it at the time, but he and his dog had shown up just in time for the English Civil War, and both of them were getting shipped off to battle. Throughout the war, it was like Rupert and Boye were inseparable, a boy and his dog travelling across the land, doing their duty for king and country. At the time, especially in England, bringing your pet dog into battle with you was a rather rare sight, so seeing a little white poodle march to and fro amongst the soldiers was incredibly endearing for the Royalists, as well as the common folk of England. The Roundheads, on the other hand, they didn't like Rupert's dog one bit. Not one bit. Not at all. In fact, from the way that some accounts describe him, it seemed as though that dog were the bane of their existence. Initially, ideas circulated around parliamentarian circles that Boye might be a witch's familiar, used by the king and his loyalists to give them a devious mystical edge over the much more down-to-earth Roundheads. As the war progressed, these notions about Boye seemed to grow, going from simply being the bestie of some cavalier conjurer to a literal incarnation of the devil himself. They really didn't like this dog. Of course, the Royalists caught wind of this, so they too began to spread their own rumours about Boye. The Cavaliers must have had some incredibly good comedians, because they took the idea of Boye's mysticism perhaps better than the Roundheads could have ever dreamed of. The rumours ranged from more benign things such as being able to detect and dig up buried treasure and helping Prince Rupert dodge cannon fire, to some absolutely ludicrous things like being a shape-shifting demon, or a Sami woman that transformed into a dog to accompany Rupert. Hell, if you would ask certain Royalist circles, they tell you that Boye was also proficient in a mix of both Hebrew and Dutch. A tish posting from the Cavaliers. Though sadly, Boye's romp across the country wasn't fated to last. On the 2nd of July 1644, he ran away from a Royalist campsite in North Yorkshire and ran straight into the Battle of Marston Moor. The battle didn't go the best for the Royalists, and Rupert had to flee. Boye, however, was stuck amidst the slowly overwhelming Roundhead force and was eventually killed during the fighting. Wait, Marston? Hang on, I know where that is. Rest easy there, boy. You were truly the goodest boy of them all. Now, how do I get out of here? As anybody who's seen the film Valiant would know, perhaps some of the most famous and exciting stories of war animals of the past century would have to be those of war pigeons, highly intelligent birds bred for communication and carrying of goods. If man's best friend is the dog, man's second best friend is but the humble carrier pigeon. There's two in particular that I'd like to talk about, a pigeon from both sides of the English Channel. Let's start on the other side of the channel and then make our way up, shall we? Early April 1918, a hatchery in the town of King's Lynn, England, is awaiting its next batch of young squabs to hatch. Little do they know, they've been incubating what would perhaps become history's most famous pigeon, CHER. Their fame, likely thanks to them being America's pigeon, despite their French name. For despite being English-born, the young pigeon was gifted to the Pigeon Service of America's Expeditionary Forces on the Western Front as part of a batch delivery. Later that year, on October 3rd, American Major Charles Whittlesey and his battalion found themselves in a rather precarious situation. They were trapped in a ditch in the rather dense forest of Argonne, with the Germans surrounding and blockading their only means of escape and communication. They were almost entirely out of food and supplies. Worse yet, because the other American forces believed they were situated just a few hundred meters north, the American artillery brigades began inadvertently firing upon them. With nowhere to run, the battalion tried their best to send out messenger pigeons to cry for help, but almost all of them were shot down and intercepted by the Germans. It was this lack of communication that would give them the moniker of the Lost Battalion. Yes, that Lost Battalion. Yet, among all of these failed attempts, there was one last hope for the battalion, a then adolescent CHER. The pigeon was sent off with a note placed in a canister attached to their leg. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it!" After almost immediately taking flight, the pigeon was spotted and shot down by the German force in the area. Yet after a few seconds, he took flight again. After 25 perilous miles of continuous flying, despite all odds, the pigeon made it back to the artillery brigade, with the message successfully delivered. After that, the remaining 194 members of the Lost Battalion were able to be rescued. CHER, however, was not in the most ideal state. They were shot through the chest, missing an eye, and after a while, missing a leg. The US Expeditionary Force were quick to send them back to the United States, where they were able to keep them alive. After living to see the end of the war and spending the next few months in relative comfort in the United States, our dear friend would be put to rest in June 1919. Their body was later taxidermied, and you can still visit it today in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Fast forward about 20 years. Over in the UK, their Army Pigeon Service from World War I had become more and more robust, becoming the National Pigeon Service in 1938 under the insistence of its founder, Major W.H. Osman. At the time, the British were perhaps the best pigeon breeders in the world, having bred a pigeon civilization's worth for the defence of king and country. Yet, from its inception, the NPS would have to contend with and justify itself against a technological advancement that had been changing the world one frequency at a time, the radio. Osman, perhaps in mild desperation to keep his division flourishing, was sceptical about these newfangled radios. After all, they were still new and prone to failure. For now, the pigeons deserved their finest hour just as much as any soldier on the ground, and so the Royal Air Force and the Minister of Defence acquiesced, giving each plane crew 2 pigeons to work with, as a last resort in the event that the radios fail for whatever reason. February 23rd, 1942. A bomber crew was returning home following a mission to Norway when they were struck down by German fire over the North Sea. The crew threw out a signal to whichever RAF base they could get a hold of first, but it was too late. They had time to throw out an SOS message, but just as Major Osmanus predicted, their radio faltered and they lost contact within seconds. For the RAF, there was no way to know where they were or even if they were still alive. With little time left, the crew looked for solutions, before deciding on a last resort, the blue checkered hen codenamed NEHU-40NSL. Through the rain and the fog and enemy fire, the bird flew for 120 miles across the North Sea. She was frightened, exhausted, and not able to fly all too well, as she'd landed in leaking oil upon the plane's impact. But after a long night of flying, she finally made it home to her roost in Dundee. Upon return, the local RAF base in Fife were immediately informed, and they were quick to come and assess the bird. The bird had been set off with no messages attached, or really anything to work with. So with little time to spare, the RAF crew got to work, and quickly deduced that with all the oil in her feathers, she couldn't have flown much further than 140 miles. Combining that with calculations of wind speed, they were able to find the rough coordinates of the downed plane. Within 15 minutes, they'd done it! With the help of their little feathered friend, they'd located the crew and sent out a rescue vessel to save them. The bomber crew returned home safe and sound, and a dinner was hosted in the bird's honour. At this dinner, the crew noticed something peculiar about the bird. After her heroic flight, she'd seemed to have developed a condition causing her right eye to constantly twitch and close, as though she were winking confidently at the crew, and so the crew came together and gave their hero a proper name of her own, WINKIE. There's a really good documentary about WINKIE and other winners of the Dickens Medal called War of the Birds. It's about 40 minutes long and entirely uploaded onto YouTube, actually. Go give it a watch, it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of war stories about perilously placed pigeons that I would love to tell, so if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know down below. Fast forward another 10 years or so, and the United Kingdom, having finally come back down to earth after the high from winning the Second World War, remembered that it was supposed to be a great power, and had to get back to work doing what great powers do. What were great powers doing at the time? That's right, nuclear weapons were all the rage in the 1950s. Could you really call yourself an international heavyweight if you didn't have an arsenal of shiny new warheads that could turn Berlin into ash in a couple of seconds? Of course, the UK had been toying with nuclear weapons since the fall of France a decade or so earlier, but by now, they were sort of old news. The USA had them, the Soviets had them, and French nukes were even on their way, and this just wouldn't do. The UK was supposed to be the great power of innovation, of technology. After all, American brawn and Soviet blood are all well and good, but it was British brains that beat the Germans, was it not? So, the British got to work innovating on their already existing nuclear technology, but what's a Brit to do when you're short on cash? Guys, I have a great idea. Blue Peacock, yes, I know, different bird, was the name of a nuclear landmine project headed by the British Army over the course of the 1950s. It was a genuinely stunning feat of engineering, if only for how cheap they were able to get away with making such weapons on such a shoestring budget. The idea was to plonk about 10 of them on the ground near the East-West German border, in the event that the Soviets came knocking on West Germany's door. Everybody sort of knew that the Western powers wouldn't be able to do much until the Soviets made it to the Rhine, so the nuclear mines were simply there to make life for the advancing Russian soldiers as miserable as possible. Though there were a problem with the integrity of these Blue Peacocks. It was believed that during winter, there was a chance that the internal components of the mines could cease to function, or worse, malfunction and blow up swathes of territory on accident. They needed to come up with a cheap and easy to regulate temperature of the bombs. Unfortunately, small, constantly running, remotely activated heating wasn't the cheapest back then, so the good folks at Fort Halstead, where the bombs were being made, had a brilliant idea. Chickens. Chickens do a pretty good job at regulating their own temperature, and could be kept alive a good while pretty easily just using water and seeds. The best part? Chickens are a fully renewable resource, and one that was practically cheap as chips for the R&D team. The plan was that during the coldest weeks of winter, a chicken would be sealed inside the bomb and left to live out its final days keeping the inside nice and snugly warm before perishing after a week or two. Once the weather was cool enough, they'd either take the chicken out and put a new one in, or just let the bombs go back to their own devices again. This did, of course, mean that in the event of a Soviet invasion in the winter, these chickens likely would have been left in there to endure the blast. Safe to say, the The chickens would have been absolutely cooked, figuratively and literally. Fortunately for chickens everywhere, not much came of these plans. The risk of possibly being responsible for miles upon miles of fallout and destruction was just too much for the British Army to justify, and the Blue Peacock experiment was eventually cancelled in February of 1958. In the end, perhaps it was for the best. As the 20th century came to a close and the 21st century blasted its way onto the scene, going to war with your neighbours was considered rather passé. As such, war animals from the last 50 years or so have been the reserve of military mascots, a lot of which are goats for some reason. Mascots like that have certainly existed beforehand, like everybody's favourite Polish alcoholic wartime bear, but I don't want to talk about Wojtek. Everybody does that. So instead, let's go somewhere a little closer to home than Poland. This video is horribly Anglo-centric, isn't it? Roughly 160 miles from where I'm currently sitting, about 111 years ago, the family of Norwegian whaler Christian Salvesen, who himself had a long history operating in and around Scotland, gifted Edinburgh Zoo their first king penguin, taken from one of their first expeditions to South Georgia, down near the Falkland Islands. Edinburgh Zoo's Norwegianly sprinkled history must have interested the Norwegian King's Guard while they were watching a drill display in the city in 1961, especially one Nils Egelian, who was a particularly big fan of the zoo's penguins during his visit. Egelian returned sometime just over 10 years later and arranged for one of the zoo's penguins to be adopted by the King's Guard, and thus they named him Nils Olav. Nils from Egelian himself, and Olav Sigurd, another official of the King's Guard and a contemporary of Egelian's. Edinburgh Zoo's website used to say that Olav in Nils Olav came from the name of the King of Norway, King Olav V, though sources I've seen on this have been a bit conflicted. I'm personally more inclined to believe the statement on an article on the Forsvarets forum. Had the king penguin been named after King Olav, Olav would have been the penguin's only name. The penguin in the zoo in Edinburgh is named after 2 guards officers. Upon adoption, Nils Olav was given the title of Lance Corporal, and it became tradition that every time the King's Guard would go back to Edinburgh to check on their mascot, he'd receive a shiny new title. Though alas, shortly after his second promotion, Sergeant Nils Olav, Baron of the Bouvet Islands, passed away after a lifetime of service, serving his beloved king to which he may or may not have been named after. Fortunately, a near-identical penguin was ready to pick up the slack and don the title of Sergeant Nils Olav II. Similarly to his predecessor, he received another promotion shortly before his death, that of a full-on knighthood in 2008. It's worth noting that the King of Norway himself, Harald V, had to personally give the green light for his knighthood, and even delivered his own special message. According to the king, Nils is in every way qualified to receive the honour and dignity of knighthood. Though, while directly authorising it is cool, the big man Harald wasn't there to knight the penguin himself, which is a shame. It would have been a delightful story to tell. With the knighthood under his belt, Nils Olav II figured he'd quit while he's ahead, and died at the ripe old age of... I don't actually know. The margin of time given for when he died is so big that I couldn't even write a joke about it. Somewhere between the ages of 21 and 29, I suppose. That brings us to our current penguin, Sir Nils Olav III. To this day, you can still see him patrol the enclosure wearing a little purple bracelet bearing his name, proudly protecting the penguins of Edinburgh and making sure the bond between Norway and the United Kingdom remains as strong as ever. He received his most recent promotion, Major General, in the August of 2023. Now, as some of you might remember, I travelled up to Edinburgh with my dear friend Theo and some other friends to visit Nils Olav. I would have loved to interview him, but unfortunately I don't speak Norwegian and Theo doesn't speak Penguin. But God bless our souls, we tried anyway. Please take a look. And here we have it, you know. That's him. What is he, Sir? Major General Nils Olav III.
Baron of the Bouvet Islands.
Baron of the Bouvet Islands. Where are the Bouvet Islands?
Down towards Antarctica.
And the Great Cold is...
Oh, so they're like near Svalbard?
Yeah, no, they're near. Other way around. I was going to say...
Antarctica.
Yeah, that's Jan Mayen.
Yeah. So I suppose that makes sense, yeah. He literally owns like his native land.
Yeah.
Is it fine cold?
That's probably where they just they found him.
Yeah.
They just make him like the king of like, what is it, like Queen Maud Land or like the Antarctic Norwegian territory?
Yeah.
Here we have Mills himself,
Yeah, that's.
leading his men into battle.
Here you see the Norwegian High Command.
That's him now.
The commander in chief.
Yeah. No, that's all the High Command of Finland.
Yeah.